move on. We have three community speakers now. Very, very pleased to welcome this afternoon to give their perspectives and perhaps even comments on the day so far. The first of our speakers, excuse me, is Charles Lloyd, who's chair of the, as he mentioned in the question this morning, chair of the Aviation Community Forum, also on the Gatwick Noise Management Board. Over to you, Charles.
Thanks very much, Roger. Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me here today. As Roger said, I'm from the Gatwick area. I'm involved in aviation both around Gatwick through its Noise Management Board and nationally through the Aviation Communities Forum. I knew almost nothing about aviation about 3 years ago, so I've been on a relatively steep learning curve. And a lot of what I've learned about the way the industry is run, about the way it's regulated, about aviation policy, has been very surprising. It's astonished me in many respects. It's a sector that's reaped the benefits of privatisation and restructuring in a very impressive and hugely successful way, with far-reaching social benefits and some economic benefits, although maybe not as much economic benefits as people sometimes like to claim. And I think we should all pay tribute to that success. But it's also a sector that, at least in my experience, thinks and behaves like no other I've ever come across before. It's a sector that enjoys and expects enormous privileges, but which, in my view, hasn't yet fully recognised that with enormous privileges go, or should go, enormous responsibility. And that's what I want to talk about today, privilege and responsibility. I'm happy to answer questions about Gatwick's approach to community engagement if people would like. But in my view, the critical issues, if your industry really wants to build better relationships, more tolerance with communities, don't start with engagement. They start with the policy and legal and regulatory frameworks that the industry operates in, with the way, if you like, that you handle the privileges that you have and the responsibilities you should have. So let's talk about those privileges for a few minutes, maybe starting with the law. One of the first things you learn as an aviation campaigner is that you're powerless. Everyone else around the table has cards that they can play. They have legal powers or policy levers or economic power or safety concerns and so on. But the people impacted by the industry have none, other than rational argument and democratic processes, and maybe mob rule at some point, because the industry is set above and beyond the law. And we all know how daft that position is. You know, I can take legal action against my local church if the bells are too loud, but there's nothing I can do, there's nothing communities can do if the industry decides to narrow flight paths over them, as has happened at Gatwick, or decides to increase the number of aircraft using a flight path by whatever, 40 or 50%, as has happened at Teddington. There is almost nothing that communities can do apart from engage. That might have made a lot of sense 100 years ago when Winston Churchill exempted your industry from nuisance claims, but I don't think it makes any sense now. Of course, it would not be acceptable for flights to be stopped every time someone took out an injunction, but a clear, accessible legal framework based on precedent and case law is the basis for tolerant relationships between those who pollute and those who suffer pollution in virtually all other sectors. Why should aviation be any different? And how much clearer would we all be now about what's acceptable and what isn't if that legal framework had been allowed to build up over the past several decades? In the absence of a functioning legal framework, you might have expected there to be thorough regulation of aviation noise, but another extraordinary privilege of your industry is the virtual absence of noise regulation. The culprits here are not the industry itself. I don't expect you to put your hand up for new regulation, but its regulators, the CAA and the DFT. The regulatory framework for NATS, for example, the industry body that's best placed to increase or reduce noise impacts, is silent on noise. The word noise doesn't exist in NATS license. You can spell it, you can word check it. The word environment comes up twice, and both of those refer to flight efficiency and fuel savings. So not surprisingly, NATS, in my view at least, is only at the start of a long journey towards taking responsibility for the noise impacts of its operations. And if NATS does want to build community tolerance, my advice is put your hand up for meaningful noise regulation. volunteer to get into that game. The signs here are really not particularly good. NAT's response to the CAA's recent consultation on its regulation says, and I'm quoting here, noise has the potential to be a significant impediment to the delivery of airspace modernisation. Well, too right it does. But look at what that language betrays. Communities are seen as an obstacle to the delivery of a more important outcome. Instead of noise reduction being one of the core objectives, it comes across as an afterthought, a problem to be managed, not a goal to be achieved. And as far as the DFT is concerned, I'm sure the easy answer every time they looked at noise regulation is to keep things as they are and hope for the best. But that simply isn't the right answer. It's not even a good answer. It's clearly not a good answer for communities. But in my view, it's also not a good answer for the industry. The price you've paid has been, and I think likely will continue to be, that airspace modernisation and maybe new capacity in the southeast simply fails to be delivered. It's too controversial. Anybody who thinks that the current, in my view, failed system of self-regulation is fit for purpose in a world where ATMs are going to go up by 50% is just deluded. Aviation noise regulation needs a root and branch reform. The department needs to take responsibility for that and lead the debate. Could be part of the answer, but it's certainly not the whole answer, and I don't believe it's an adequate answer as it's currently being defined. Some could argue that noise is too complex or too subjective or too local to be regulated effectively. I think we would reject that absolutely. Last week, the community groups represented on DFT's Airspace Noise Engagement Group put forward a detailed proposal for noise regulation based on tried and tested regulatory technology used in other UK sectors for many decades. Those proposals are being discussed at tomorrow's annual meeting at DFT. I imagine that the knee-jerk reaction from the industry, and maybe from the department, will be to try and pick holes in those proposals. I hope they're not. I hope you'll respond much more positively and try to find ways in which an objective, independent regulatory system can work for all parties. If you really want to build community tolerance, you need that every bit as badly as we do. Regulation of the industry simply has not kept pace with the changes in its structure and the impacts that it has, and must now catch up. The models that worked 30 years ago when BAA was state-owned and NATS was part of the CAA simply don't work any longer. Another extraordinary privilege the industry has is your Houdini-like, if you want, escape from responsibility for the external impacts you have. If you go back to the 2003 aviation white paper, it said that the industry should pay the external costs its activities impose on society. In other words, it said, and again I'm quoting, the price of air travel should reflect its environmental and societal impacts. So where are we 15 years later? Compensation is trivial compared to the industry's impacts. The cost of travel reflects only a small proportion of its environmental externalities, and the industry is arguing furiously for further tax reductions. Now, you obviously wouldn't expect the industry to put its hand up for additional costs, but this state of affairs should be an acute embarrassment to ministers and officials at DFT. I mean, of course, low-cost flying is a populist golden goose, but sometimes the government is there to do the right thing as well as the popular thing. And the list goes on. Just two more points I wanted to make on privileges. Does the industry really think that running the Future Airspace Strategy Programme as a community-free zone is a good idea? One of the objectives of FAS, we're told, is to minimise the impact of aviation on the environment. But there's no one in the room at FAS meetings who represents environment or community interests. Is that seriously going to build community tolerance? And secondly, and Tim Johnson referred to this earlier, you seem as an industry to have very little interest in the health impacts of your activities. There's lots of evidence of those impacts from third parties, but I've seen virtually nothing from the industry. You seem to have a sort of see no evil, hear no evil approach. To me, that doesn't say much about your willingness to take responsibility. And so on. So let's be clear. From where I sit, the foundations for community tolerance, the policy and the regulatory and the cultural environments needed for it to develop simply don't exist currently. Consultative committees, community noise boards, ICANN, all of those are welcome, but they're not enough. And I don't want to play down the importance of engagement, particularly given everything we heard this morning from Nicole and Paul on the importance of non-acoustic factors. Engagement is critical. But the answer isn't to keep saying the same thing in different ways, or to set up new forums for people to talk to each other about the same old issues. It's not to keep telling us, rather patronisingly as the DFT airspace consultation did, that we don't understand the reasons for change, or we can't see how decisions are arrived at. The problems, in my view, lie in the industry's policy and cultural frameworks, the privileges it expects, and that the department has got used to giving it. The answer is to change those policies and that culture. Don't keep banging your head against a brick wall. Look at how you can rebuild the wall. If you are serious about change, there's never been a better time. Airspace policy is changing, aviation strategy is changing, airspace design itself may be changing. So if you are serious, what should you do? I've got 5 suggestions. First, work with communities and the government to design and put in place a comprehensive, independent system of regulation for aviation noise. Secondly, accept that the industry has to meet a far higher proportion of the external costs it imposes on communities, both through compensation and through taxation. Thirdly, rethink the place that noise has in your planning processes. Stop behaving as if it's something secondary, something to be mitigated, but which is subservient to your growth ambitions. Start thinking of noise impacts as a precondition of growth, that you can't have one without the other. Fourth, open your doors. No more pretending that you can design airspace for the next few decades in cosy industry-only rooms. I think this tool is a helpful way to do that, but it needs to start way back from using the tool. It needs to start in those discussions on FAS. What are the trade-offs that are acceptable but not acceptable in redesign? And fifthly, get serious about the health impacts of your business. Those are big challenges. They'd amount to a revolution in the way the industry is regulated and managed. Some of you will probably think they're unrealistic. Some of you won't be interested. You'd rather focus on short-term issues, and I don't criticise that. But I do hope that some of you will recognise that alongside the extraordinary privileges you enjoy go serious responsibilities, which you and the regulators and the policymakers who oversee you need to start to live up to. We need a generation of policymakers and industry executives who recognise that change is both needed and is in the industry's long-term best interests. As Lord Callanan said, we need people prepared to take ownership and leadership of noise issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.